afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started for this afternoon. Welcome to everyone. There will be likely more people arriving later, but we're going to go ahead and kick things off so that we have enough time for our speaker. My name is Brandon Williams. I'm the director of the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center on Ethics and Leadership in the Hobby School of Public Affairs here. Today, we host the 11th annual Richard Gelwick Endowed Lecture. And I want to take a moment to note the presence of Alan Gelwick, Richard Gelwick's son, whom I just see. Okay. Thank you for being here to honor your father's legacy. A few comments about Richard Gelwick. The Reverend Richard L. Gelwick was an educator, a theologian, and a constant advocate for the issues of justice. In the 1960s, he served as campus minister at the University of California, Berkeley, where he worked with anti-war protesters and free speech advocates. He later joined the religion and philosophy departments at Chapman College and Stevens College, before becoming professor and chair of the medical humanities in the College of Osteopathic Medicine at the University of New England. Richard Gelwick's scholarship focused on connections between science and faith, which led him to be a strong advocate for gender and racial justice in society and in higher education. This interest in the interplay of science and faith also led him to publish 2 books exploring the philosophy of Michael Polanyi. Writing toward the ends of his life, Gelwick notes, quote, "The perennial problem of human society is the translation of love into justice in the domain of common life. Discerning how to translate love into justice and mercy in the complex modern world is a fundamental issue which deserves more scrutiny than it currently receives in the busy contemporary university. The university at its best is a domain of genuine inquiry, and it trains citizens and leaders for society. Social improvement through democratic processes requires steady work and a steady vision. While social progress begins with individual personal commitment, it only succeeds as people work together over long periods of time." Today, we honor Richard Gelwick's life and work by considering contemporary society and democracy in light of the social media that have become ubiquitous in our daily lives and interactions with one another. Siva Vaidyanathan is the Robertson Professor of Media Studies and Director of Center for Media and Citizenship at the University of Virginia. Having authored multiple books such as The Googleization of Everything, Copyrights and Copy Wrongs, our topic today, anti-social media, you saw the QR code on the screen earlier, it will also be available later. Professor Vaidyanathan is perfectly situated to continue the theme of the Elizabeth D. Rockwell Center's speaker series this year, titled Rebooting Our Relationship with Technology. With numerous academic appointments at universities throughout the United States and elsewhere, Professor Vaidyanathan brings real experience and perspective to this subject. He's written for The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, The Guardian, and The Nation, among other venues, many other venues. The Washington Post, I already mentioned that. He's also appeared on BBC, CNN, NBC, MSNBC, ABC, The Daily Show. In 2016, he was even portrayed as a character in the play Privacy at the Public Theater in New York City. Clearly an uncommon accolade for an academic. We live in a precarious time for human society, a time in which our bonds with one another face numerous threats. One way to meet these threats is through coming to understand them, and in so doing, coming to a deeper understanding of ourselves and our place in the world. It is thus with great pleasure that I introduce this year's Richard Gelwick Endowed Lecture speaker, Professor Siva Vaidyanathan.
Get the slides up. Oh, yeah.
And then yours is minimized.
Cool.
Yep.
Well, this should advance it, right?
It should.
Let's see.
Well, it's
First, we got to start it.
Yeah.
I'm only a media studies professor. I don't really know how to do all this right now. There we go. Cool. Just make sure it works. This should work, otherwise I can use the keyboard. Hi, thanks for attending this. Thank you for inviting me. This is a really great honor for me. I lived in Texas for 14 years. I still think of myself as a Texan. I no longer do. I live in Virginia now. I have for the last 20 years. But I have a deeper emotional connection to institutions like the University of Houston. My entire higher education, from my bachelor's degree through my PhD, was done at a public university in the state of Texas. Another one that's like you take 10 west and then 71 north. And this is a precarious moment, as you know, for higher education in the entire country, but especially in the state of Texas. And so I feel a deep love and respect for those of you who are making stands, pushing back, and defending institutions like this, defending its research, and defending its teaching, especially the breadth and diversity of its teaching, defending the breadth and diversity of its representation in terms of students, faculty, and staff. These are all deep, important values, and they are democratic values. For those of us who believe in democracy, those of us who hope that democracy can thrive at its fullest, we must keep defending the principle that we need the widest range of voices and experiences in these institutions, affecting all areas of learning. We have to defend the idea that not all areas of learning must have an immediate return on investment, that in fact the return on investment often speaks to values beyond the economic, the financial, values like efficiency. There's more to life than that. That's what this lecture is about. I'm thrilled that this lecture and this series and this center sit in a School of Public Policy. That's not a very common arrangement at schools of public policy, at professionally oriented schools, but it speaks volumes to the leadership of this school, to the leadership of this university, to the Hobby family, that such a center can thrive and exist and attract such a nice audience and turnout on a day like today. So we are also at a precarious moment for democracy in general, not just in the United States, because of course we are now at a moment when masked law enforcement who refuse to identify themselves thusly, who act like soldiers yet are not trained like soldiers, who seem to flout every rule of engagement and most rule of law, are terrorizing our fellow citizens throughout the country. We are at a moment when those of us who are immigrants or descendants of immigrants or look like we might be immigrants or speak with an accent that might indicate that we might be immigrants or worship in a way that might indicate we might be immigrants or carry names that indicate we might be immigrants are all terrified. That is no way to run a democracy. That is no way to ensure trust and love among our fellow citizens. So we're all exhausted by this state of things. Today, I'd like to talk about how we might have gotten to this situation. I don't have a full explanation, nobody does, but I have some insight and some elements I want to bring to you. I don't have a way out. If I did, I would have a much different job. I would be doing much different work. But I do have hope. And the hope I have exists in this room. Because this is a monument to democracy, this university, this gathering, this center, this school. These are sites of thought, sites of deliberation, sites of contemplation, sites of community. And we need more of that. We need more of that. We don't just need communication, even though that's what I do for a living, that's what I study for a living. We need all the rest. We need to be in the same room together. We need to look each other in the eye. We need to show mutual respect. Democracy, justice, all other good things cannot exist without those basic habits. So again, thank you for coming to this room today. Thank you for being part of this conversation. And I wonder if I am causing that hum. You're not. I'm not. Air conditioning, okay. All right, let's just ignore it. All right. All right. I'm going to bring you back to 2008. Some of you were 2 years old, 3 years old, 4 years old, 5 years old. I understand that. And now you're saying, oh my God, he's going to give us ancient history. 2008 was a crucial year in American democracy and in the world's democracy. 2008, Google celebrated its 10th birthday. It's a very young company. In 2008, Facebook celebrated its 4th birthday. Also a very young company. In 2008, Google had just introduced both Gmail a few years earlier, but it was still fairly recent, and had introduced a new operating system for mobile devices in a scurried attempt to catch up to the iPhone, which had been introduced in 2007. Up until that time, we didn't carry computers around with us very much. Some of us did. There were a handful of rudimentary devices through which you could text and make phone calls and use email, but there wasn't this sort of full suite of applications. We weren't constantly connected. In fact, we used to use terms, maybe you still do, like online and offline, as if that distinction matters anymore. But it once did. You had to, if you wanted to communicate with institutions or other people, you had to take time out of your day and sit at a desk and log on and connect with, and then do your business, and then log off. And that meant that you actually had to budget time for such activities. We weren't all nodes in a grand data flow, which we are now, right? We're all completely connected, completely immersed in this field. So again, not so long ago, and a very different environment, a very different ecosystem. That's how quickly things have changed. So 2008, a couple of other things happened. There was a major election in the United States of America. In 2008, a technologically savvy young senator from Illinois was the Democratic nominee for president of the United States. In 2008, a veteran of the Vietnam War, a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War, a former prisoner of war, a person who had made a national reputation by fighting corruption, made a national reputation by being one who could compromise with the other party, a firm patriot, was the nominee of the Republican Party. How far we have come. So, this seemed like a pretty good year for democracy. The American people had a choice between an older man who had served with distinction and heroism, who was a person of seemingly impeccable morals, and a younger man who offered a vision of the future and a very different set of policy proposals. And the two were both US senators. The two had worked together. The two had mutual friends and mutual respect. This was a political environment at which you might have expected we could have been at our best. And in many ways we were. In many ways it was a nice year to appreciate American democracy. And then everything fell apart. Not because of either of those candidates, but because the global financial system collapsed. The global financial system buckled in on each other. Why? I could do a whole lecture or maybe write 400 pages about why. Other people have. Let me summarize it by saying that over the previous 10 or 12 or 16 years, governments around the world, in largely the wealthier liberal democracies of the world, had structured their financial systems to reward speculation, irresponsible speculation. And that class of speculators that had achieved political power and had changed the rules for how money flows and how investments work did not pay a price for the collapse that they caused. The rest of us did. That economic collapse and the subsequent bailout of those institutions shifted wealth across the world from the less wealthy to the more wealthy. It also, the response to that collapse, which was executed in the early years of the Obama administration, because if you don't know the rest of the story, Senator Obama won, became President Obama, and immediately had to try to fix this problem. And similar efforts went on in the United Kingdom, in Canada, in Ireland, around the world. Efforts to reinflate the financial system, efforts to re-engage spending, efforts to bring some sort of confidence to the world economy. That moment was the scariest economic moment since 1929. Since 1938, basically. We were on the verge of a global depression beyond anything we had ever experienced. It was a frightening time. And those policy interventions made a difference, right? Reinflated the financial system. A lot of people lost their homes. Many more would have lost their homes if there had not been immediate policy interventions. Those policy interventions were compromises. They were imperfect, inadequate in some ways. The result of those years I will return to in a moment. And I want you to sort of pin that notion of tremendous fear across the world, tremendous frustration, tremendous loss of wealth and shift of wealth that happened between 2008 and 2010. Meanwhile, we're all buying smartphones. That's the new thing. Meanwhile, we're jumping onto this new thing called social media that was very attractive. Between 2008 and 2012, Facebook, Twitter, which actually was born in 2008 as well, and a few other systems started proliferating in other languages. By 2011, Facebook had appeared in Arabic and about 30 other languages. Eventually, Facebook would be available in more than 250 languages. But still, they had made some huge leaps in a very short period of time, making the world open to Facebook. Google was doing the same sort of proliferation of languages. Now, to make a proliferation of languages, to be able to have those systems work in multiple languages, they needed to train their systems to understand and translate different languages. Now, to do that, they needed to do something that now we're very familiar with as a large language model that we put under the umbrella of artificial intelligence. Now, they were developing all of this stuff at that time, investing tremendously in those sorts of technologies that now we think of as chatbots that write papers for us. But in fact, they had been built in early on for language translation and language interpretation for the sake of making their systems smarter, making their systems more globally available, making their systems work across languages. They had other goals. They had long-term goals of having a very robust collection of what we now call artificial intelligence. I guess it was then called artificial intelligence, but they weren't really flying the flag of that at the time. At the time, they were talking about the social. So again, in that 4 years between 2008 and 2012, they're rapidly deploying these systems. They're rapidly ramping up what we now think of as large language models inside their systems, to the point where, as I said, in 2011, Facebook's available in Arabic. The spring of 2011, actually, let's say the winter of 2011, it was January and February, to everyone's surprise, the governments of Tunisia and Egypt collapsed. The dictatorial, long-term governments of those two countries collapsed. They collapsed under the pressure of demonstrations in the streets that were led by a variety of elements of those societies, including labor unions, including religious groups, both Christian and Muslim, including left-wing elements, including pro-democracy elements, including students, including soccer fans. Actually, soccer fans were tremendously important in organizing street protests in those countries. Now, even back in 2011, media organizations, news reporting organizations in the United States and Europe had pulled back their foreign coverage. They had pulled back their foreign coverage to the point where basically only a handful of news organizations were stationed in Cairo, had bureaus in Cairo. The BBC had a bureau in Cairo. The New York Times had a bureau in Cairo. There wasn't a longer list, really. And Cairo is one of the most important cities in the world, one of the largest cities in the world. Sort of a capital culturally and otherwise of two regions that are deeply important to the world. And yet we were ignoring it. So how do we find out about what's going on in Cairo or Alexandria? Well, there were a number of activists in those countries who were reporting for us, who were telling us what was going on in the streets of those countries. How were they getting their message out? Facebook and Twitter. Now, from our point of view, sitting in these comfortable countries, we see that we're learning about all of this activity and the ultimate overthrow of these governments that we never thought would fall by looking at Facebook and Twitter. And so it was easy to make the mistake of thinking that the presence of English language expression on Facebook and Twitter, and by the way, Twitter was not available in Arabic at the time, meant that Facebook and Twitter were instrumental in the uprisings and those establishments for a brief period of time of what looked like what might be democracy in those countries. That was a huge error through which we assume the lens we're looking is the machine that's causing what was going on. Those uprisings in North Africa and by the way, they didn't end in North Africa. The similar uprisings happened in Morocco, places as different as Morocco, Bahrain, Syria, Libya, for different reasons, against different styles of leaders, with different elements, but one thing in common for all of them was youth. Young people were fed up with the levels of corruption, lack of opportunities, lack of freedoms in all of those countries. And most of those countries had a lot of young people relatively, right? They were very young countries. And they didn't all succeed, right? Those movements, like there was no revolution in Morocco, there was reform. There was no revolution in Bahrain. There was a revolution in Syria, but no one wants to brag about that going well. There was a revolution ultimately in Libya. That turned out to be much more difficult and thorny than in other places. And ultimately, as you probably know, the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia did not turn out well, right? Did not turn out well in the long run and reverted to different forms of authoritarianism. So it wasn't a great moment. But in that moment, in 2011, there was tremendous optimism and enthusiasm for the role of social media in connecting people who believed in democracy and were willing to fight for democracy. It was an illusion, but it was widely held and adopted. The United States Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, went around the world proclaiming that the United States supported internet freedom because it would liberate the world. Conveniently, it meant also supporting American-based companies like Google and Facebook. But it wasn't well thought out and wasn't well studied. Still, this was the story we were told. Well, now, as we look around the world, and I've already cited some issues we should all have with the state of American democracy, it's important to remember that this is not an American problem. Democracy is shaky or in retreat all over the world, often in the form of illiberal democracy, democracy that still has the structure and practice of democracy, like basic voting, at the same time has severe limitations on civil liberties, on due process, on the rule of law. Places like Hungary, places like India, that, you can vote, but it's not really going to make that much difference. We almost saw that, by the way, in Mexico. Mexico was on the verge of turning into a very illiberal democracy, and then the recent election has sort of at least brought some more oxygen into the system, and slightly different leadership into the system. Right? I could name a bunch of other places, the Philippines, Indonesia. We could also talk about places that have never had anything close to liberal democracies that are getting worse. Uzbekistan, Myanmar, Pakistan, right? These are places that have much more of a crackdown. China, much more of a crackdown than they did a couple of decades earlier, of a government of a strong authoritarian system, right? Democracy seems to be in retreat in Western Europe, where illiberal parties are gaining in strength, even in places like the Netherlands, Sweden, but definitely in places like Poland, Italy, the next elections in France, the next elections in Germany, and next elections in the UK might result in xenophobic parties being at least participants in government power. So things are shaky all over, all over. We are not unique. Well, that raises a lot of questions for those of us who are trying to analyze the situation. If you can't look at the frustrations and weaknesses of democracy in the United States and blame it on a party or a policy or a condition that are US specific, because the US isn't so special, right? If the Philippines, if Brazil, if Mexico are undergoing a lot of the same pressures, a lot of the same frustrations, we have to ask, what are the commonalities? Well, one thing that all of these places in the world shared during this period of time, from 2008 to the present, is Facebook, right? It is a global phenomenon, China accepted. That's one place where Facebook does not have a market, but that's always a different story. And even if Facebook is not the whole story, Instagram is part of the story, WhatsApp is part of the story. They're both owned by Meta, same company, right? Google's part of the story, YouTube's part of the story. Hey, it's owned by Google/Alphabet. Twitter's not really part of the story. It never really has been. It never was very big. It's kind of a myth we get in the United States because, you know, we have a president who used it a lot, and a lot of celebrities used it, and it was a very American thing. But globally, Twitter's almost had no influence on the world, I have to say. But that notion of social media has been global and pervasive. So that should lead us to another simplistic conclusion. And that simplistic conclusion is maybe social media is to blame for the erosion of democracy around the world. Well, I'm here to tell you, actually no. Because blame is too simple and almost always wrong. The erosion of democracy around the world has many, many causes. And they're different in different parts of the world. But there are consistencies. And the extent to which our media ecosystems have changed in similar ways around the world has mattered. To the point of, and this is where I would go, these platforms have contributed to and amplified flaws that have helped erode democracy around the world. Therefore, not caused, but have been part of the story. Part of the story. Why? Because every one of these platforms is what we call a socio-technical system. It's a system that is not separate from the people who use the system. These are systems that learn from the people who use the system, that reflect the actions, opinions, expressions of the people who use the system. So the people are out there. But these systems are not neutral. They have biases built into them. And those biases are not expressible in the standard left-right American political spectrum. No, the biases are toward recency and strong emotions. So what they amplify is any content that has been shown over time to spark strong emotions, because strong emotions keep us coming back. And these are systems designed to keep us coming back, a lot like casinos. They're designed along the same lines as casinos, frankly, to make us wish we were still there, to make us address our boredom and our stasis by scrolling Instagram or scrolling TikTok. They are designed to give you that little pull, that little feel like, hey, you know, maybe I should check. Maybe I should get that little reward. Maybe somebody laughed at my meme. Maybe somebody laughed at my joke. Maybe somebody got upset by my political statement. I want to see what the reaction is, right? It's not a strong, powerful feeling, but it's just enough that we keep coming back to it. And that's exactly what these businesses have structured their systems to do, because these businesses have structured their systems fundamentally to place and target ads as specifically as possible to your interests and to keep you engaged as much as possible. And it's quite a battle for your attention, right? In a world in which we all could be playing video games, or we could be watching Netflix, or we could be playing Dungeons and Dragons, or attending lectures at universities, lots of options. Why would anybody hang out on TikTok? It better be entertaining. And it is. And it is. And it's designed to hook you and keep you there. So our attention phrase. And as I said, these systems amplify the sorts of content that get us worked up in sometimes positive ways. So what flies through these systems? What actually gets amplified through these systems? Dance, right? Fun dances, cute puppies, cute babies, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, indignation of all sorts, paranoia, conspiracy theories. There's nothing in the middle here. There's no space for the serious, the deep, the contemplative, the rich, the subtle. Subtle stuff doesn't fly on TikTok. Try being subtle on TikTok. Try being subtle on Instagram. Try being subtle on Facebook. No one will care, right? No one will care. You have to rile people up to get attention through these things. Well, what does that do over time? What does that do over time? People engage with these systems to handle more and more of our connections in life, right? They were created to keep up with our social networks, our collections of friends near and far, our families. That's the good stuff. That's why we all signed on to them in the first place. But soon they proliferated into sites through which we engage in commerce, in worship, in hobbies, in sports fandom, in politics. The list could go on. You probably have your own 8 or 9 more things that I haven't mentioned. But all of these crucial areas of life, ways through which we connect with other human beings, we now can and often do perform through these platforms. So what does that do to us? Well, it habituates us to it, but also by crowding out or ignoring those ways of thinking and being that are subtle, that are complex, that are open, engaging, that are deep and deliberative, by having those relatively silenced, not completely silenced, just harder to find and harder to promote, we push our attention toward those things that are cheap, shallow, fun, angry, weird, all good. We need all that stuff. Just like we need the occasional ice cream or potato chips, but we also need our broccoli. But these systems have no space for broccoli, right? It's all ice cream and potato chips. And we don't want to live in a world without ice cream and potato chips, but we won't live long in a world without broccoli, right? So that's the situation we're in. So if you want my explanation for the role that these platforms have played in the erosion of democracy and many other good things, that's the key to it. The long-term habitual erosion of our ability to attend to the practice of deliberation. So when we have things about which we should deliberate, the climate is a serious threat to all of us. Globally, infectious diseases are a serious threat to all of us. Just were, will probably be again soon. The migration of millions of people from rural areas to urban areas, from the equatorial regions to the poles, largely because of climate, the migration of people fleeing the very rise of autocracy and brutality in their countries, the people who are migrating by the millions to seek different economic and financial futures, because the world is very unequal in those terms as well. Those have caused tremendous stresses in societies around the world. It is an issue we must confront carefully, fairly, openly, scientifically, and we must do so without bigotry, anger, fear, and myth. All of these issues, right? Just to name three, right? Climate, global infectious diseases, and human migration. And those are not disconnected ideas either, right? Those are not disconnected phenomena. But they're all deep threats to our well-being. There are also, in many cases, opportunities for us to consider how to improve our well-being. And if we had the capacity to think through those issues seriously, scientifically, but also socially and culturally, imaginatively, and do so without hatred and bigotry and paranoia and conspiracies, we might actually have a chance. So democracy is not just about voting. Voting is downstream of the cultural practice of deliberation. And the cultural practice of deliberation is mastered in institutions. Institutions that over centuries we have built up to avoid immediate gratification or defer gratification, right? And those include houses of worship. Those include monasteries. Those include museums, libraries, public schools, universities, other similar institutions that bring people together for purposes other than immediate gratification. You are going to spend at least 4 years in these buildings or buildings like it. That's deferred gratification. There are lots of other things you could be doing right now. Lots of other things that could bring immediate gratification instead of sitting here with me. This is classic deferred gratification, right? Nobody reads the Torah for immediate gratification, right? Nobody opens up the Torah and starts giggling, right? You spend years studying it in a language you might never use anywhere else. Nobody studies the Quran for immediate gratification, right? You have to learn to read the other way anyway. Like, it's hard, but you do it because there is something else. There is something else that involves the engagement with something complicated, difficult, and valuable, but not valuable because reading the Torah is going to get you a better job, or reading the Torah is going to get you better loan rates, or reading the Torah is going to get your papers written faster, right? No, none of that. It's not about immediate gratification. We built up these institutions to defer gratification, to push values other than the immediate, other than the shallow, other than the entertaining. But as we've shifted our resources, our imagination, our talent, our capital, and our attention to platforms that only reward and feed back on immediate gratification, we are evaporating and evacuating institutions like this. We are disinvesting from institutions like this. So I actually want to posit the difference between reading the Torah and scrolling Instagram, between working in a chemistry lab at the University of Houston and scrolling TikTok. There is tension there. There is tension over our time, our money, and our attention and resources. A real battle. And guess which side is losing right now, right? So this practice of deliberation, a word we don't hear enough of and we don't think enough about, this practice of deliberation is crucial to science, to engineering, to democracy, to religion, to all of these other things, and frankly, to commerce. We would be much worse at commerce if we didn't deeply deliberate about where to put our money, about how to structure our economic system, All of that requires deep deliberation, which is why we have institutions like this in the first place, why we should be putting more resources into them, why we should be allowing people to be more open, creative, bold, and free in them, not less. Why we should be inviting more voices and more experiences rather than fewer. But as I said, we're going the opposite direction. And it worries me because maybe I'm wrong, but I see these trends as being similar across all these areas of life. Now, you probably came here thinking I was going to talk deeply about social media, and I can if you want it. But I really thought this was a good time to look at what I call the Great Scramble. Because we've scrambled our attention, and we've scrambled our sense of value in the past, let's say 25 years, this century. Now, I started this story in 2008. I could have started this story 20 years earlier when democracy seemed to be ascendant as well. Maybe actually 19 years earlier, right? 19 years earlier than that, something rather unexpected happened, something more unexpected than the fall of the dictatorship in Egypt, something really earth-shattering, which was the fall of the Eastern Bloc, the most formidable threat to the growth of democracy and freedom that we had seen in the 20th century. Up until 1989, we really had no reason to think that a significant portion of the world would ever be free, open, and capable of deliberation, liberty, rule of law, etc., all those good things. And in a real short period of time, between 1989 and 1991, everything changed. China didn't change that much, but everything else changed. And I was a young person at the time. I was in my 20s. And I didn't think things were going to change that fast. And it kind of rocked me. And it rocked a lot of people who were around my age. All of a sudden, anything seemed possible. All of a sudden, it seemed like democracy was a good idea to everybody in the world, or almost everybody in the world, if we just handled it right. Well, we didn't handle it right. And that wasn't that long ago. That wasn't that long ago. And we seem to be reverting from that moment. And we seem to be reverting from that moment because we took certain things for granted, because we allowed other things to be corrupted, and because we keep making decisions to adopt practices into our lives without thinking through them, without actually examining whether they're good ideas. Come on, I guess I'm not using this. I'm going to use this. All right, so getting back to 2011, we thought social media was going to bring the world together. In fact, if you go back and listen to Mark Zuckerberg's speeches or interviews in those early days, that was what he was all about. In fact, he still believes it. That social media is about connecting human beings and getting beyond our immediate biases and bigotries. He truly believes to this day that if we engage with people distant from us and different from us through Facebook, we will all learn to respect each other and not hurt each other. This could not be a more ahistorical point of view, right? Neighbors often hate each other. Neighbors kill each other. Family members mistreat each other, right? There's nothing about proximity and connection that yields mutual respect and love necessarily, right? There always has to be more, right? Nonetheless, this is his firm belief. And he built Facebook idealistically. And this is something I think a lot of people don't quite grasp about him. He's not a greedy capitalist at his heart. He's an idealist libertarian at his heart. He truly believes, Mark Zuckerberg truly believes that by allowing people to freely express themselves and connect with each other at great distances, we will get over our problems and solve our problems. He thinks the mere act of connection, even if it's structured and influenced by his own algorithms, that can lead us to better decisions and better lives. Now, these platforms are all different, and I think that's really important to remember. when we say social media, often we imagine that they all work the same, and they don't. There are certain similarities. The process of algorithmic amplification is common among all of them, with the exception of those that are largely text-based, or by text-based I don't mean the medium of text, but the act of texting, like WhatsApp, right? WhatsApp is not algorithmically driven, but the rest of these are. The rest of these are, and that matters because who gets to choose the weights of those algorithms? Who gets to decide what is important? The people inside the company in a very opaque fashion, right? They sometimes respond to public opinion, but frankly, rarely. And again, it's opaque. We can't know what they're favoring, except in the most general senses, what they say and admit, sometimes the papers that leak out of their offices, and often by social science, doing studies on what actually flows on these systems. That's how we're able to understand, to a large degree, what gets amplified by these things. Now, the rapid adoption I sort of explained already. Facebook was created in 2004. It was not the first major social network, but it was the most successful model. Before that, we had MySpace, which was available only in English, largely only in the United States, and didn't really scale well. And before that, we had Friendster and a few others, and Friendster ended up collapsing because the people who created it didn't think it would become that popular, and so they didn't work on the infrastructure of the system. They didn't work on sufficient server space or bandwidth, and it got so popular really fast that it basically collapsed and stopped working. There were a few, by the way, in those years, there were a few other competitors to Google as well that seemed to offer a better experience than Google, and they all collapsed too because they had not had enough money to invest in the infrastructure that kept them going. And when things failed, people pretty soon abandoned them, and that's what happened to a lot of these competing companies. That's why we have basically a monopoly of search and a monopoly of social media when it comes to Meta as the controller of some of the biggest. So, by the way, the biggest social media platforms in the world. Number one is Facebook. Facebook has nearly 3 billion users around the world. 3 billion users. There are 7.5 billion humans. Almost half of them are on Facebook. There has never been another system or system of expression or network that has touched half of humanity. The BBC never touched half of humanity. CNN never touched half of humanity, right? The New Testament never touched half of humanity. Facebook is almost half of humanity. And if it were allowed to operate in China, it would be a lot more than that, right? Nearly 3 billion. At about 2 billion is Instagram. At about 1.5 billion is TikTok and rising. And one of the ceilings on TikTok's rise, by the way, is that in 2020, India banned TikTok. So it can't get into the largest country in the world. It did so, by the way, at the request of Mark Zuckerberg, who was very close to Narendra Modi, and Zuckerberg asked to ban TikTok at a moment of high nationalism and anti-Chinese sentiment in India after a border dispute. So there was widespread concern and anger about China, and Zuckerberg and Modi took advantage of that moment to make sure that people used Instagram almost exclusively in India. Zuckerberg tried to do the same thing here, right? He tried to convince Congress and 2 consecutive administrations that TikTok was a national security threat and that China was the enemy in order to strengthen the control of Instagram over people's attention. It's a long, complicated story, but he largely failed in this country to do that. So those are the 3 largest. WhatsApp is right up there at about 1.5 billion users. YouTube has about 2 billion users. Whether YouTube is included in this group is a sort of metaphysical argument or consideration. But basically, we're talking about 2 companies and then TikTok, which is in flux right now, controlling and influencing the attention of billions of people in a variety of ways. All right, so what do we know? Well, we know the following. We've seen Political campaigns use social media in a variety of ways. There's been a lot of studies about it. If you step back and you look at the larger trends, it's kind of like, yeah, people use what's available to them to communicate with other people, right? There's nothing that spectacular about it. Sometimes we get overwhelmed with the new, like we think, oh my gosh, this is new, it must be important. Or this is new, it must be crucial, it must be the thing. And that's not always the case. So of course, social media has influenced elections and electoral practices. Campaign practices have changed quite a bit in the last 25 years. But fundamentally, campaigns are doing the same thing they always have, trying to motivate potential supporters, not having to do too much heavy lifting to convince them to take action like volunteer and vote, and on occasion, trying to persuade those who are not yet persuaded. Although, as we all know, that is actually a rather small part of what a campaign does. Campaigns are mostly interested in motivating the like-minded to outnumber the differently minded, right? And social media is perfect for that because it's a really cheap and easy way to find the like-minded. If you want to understand both the social and political influence of social media, think about that. They are really powerful machines to find people who think like you. If you are a huge fan of the Houston Astros, you could not find an easier place to connect with other fans of the Houston Astros. If you are into crocheting, if you're into unicycles, if you're into believing the world is flat, if you're into believing that no one ever walked on the moon, if you're into believing that Jews control the financial systems of the world, Facebook's really good for finding other like-minded people who believe wacky stuff like that, right? And that ease of finding people, thus lowering search costs, as economists would say, is tremendously important. So the political effect of social media is not so much how campaigns use it, although they do all of those things. It's really how the rest of us use it to find and collaborate, connect and collaborate with other like-minded people, and that then can be translated into politics. So, for instance, this notion that people didn't walk on the moon. In the 1970s, this was a real thing. There were people who wrote books claiming that the moon landing was all faked. And they had like lots of charts and graphs and photographs that they were pulling apart to show that all these images were faked, right? There were conventions and conversations, and even a movie that came out in the late 1970s starring O.J. Simpson that seemed to purport that the moon landing was faked. And it was really kind of a weird subgroup that believed this, but it took a lot of effort for this subgroup to identify like-minded people, to find other people who believed it, to recruit new members. It took a lot of effort. So it never became a big thing, right? It wasn't like something that millions of Americans bought into. It was a fringe phenomenon, and therefore largely comical. Now it is not a fringe phenomenon. It is actually a pretty strong set of beliefs that are just as wacky. Fortunately, they don't actually cause any harm except by undermining faith in institutions, but, you know, what doesn't these days? And that's because they can find each other through social media, through Instagram, through Facebook, through Reddit. It's so easy to find other people who believe things like that, or who are susceptible to things like that, or might be entertained by believing things like that, or might like being told that they're smarter than everybody because they believe things like that, right? And as I said, the moon landing, who cares if people believe the moon landing happened, right? That's something like Nicki Minaj is already weird, she's saying her own things, whatever, like it doesn't really hurt anybody. But what if we're talking about vaccines, right? This notion that vaccines are either dangerous or ineffective was not a mainstream thought before social media. It was hard to find people around the world who doubted that polio had been largely wiped out from the earth, that smallpox had been wiped out from the earth, that measles had largely been wiped out from the earth because of these harmless yet tremendously effective public domain medications, right? which is one of the reasons the Earth's population bloomed in the late 20th century, because people stopped dying of measles and people stopped dying of polio. I mean, what a tremendous boon to humankind. And yet, now, there are a lot of people around the world who doubt the efficacy and safety of vaccines for no good reason, based on no evidence. And now those people are actually embedded in the halls of power of Washington, D.C. I mean, how did that happen? That is so much more important than who won or lost a particular election. Not that those elections haven't had some results there. But those search costs of finding people who are otherwise susceptible to that sort of conspiracy theory have dropped to the point where it's so easy to recruit millions of people, some of them quite powerful, into believing wacky, destructive things like vaccines are dangerous or ineffective. And we have children with measles in America in 2025. We have children with measles in America in 2025. We have whole counties in Texas that have measles outbreaks that are impossible to control right now. Like, how did we get to that point? And what role do these platforms have in it? Well, they leverage and amplify sentiment that's already there in society. That's the important thing here. They attract those who wish to manipulate other people with these ideas. They perfect and empower the campaigns to make these things have a difference in the world. That's what a change in the information ecosystem can do. Again, they're not causes, they're amplifiers. And that's a perfect example. We've had other issues and concerns about social media. And a lot of this demands further study. I have to say, a lot of this is still up in the air. Changes in communication norms, changes in how we accept and judge certain sources of expression, that seems to be in flux. Certainly changes in the political economy of media, because these companies are so successful and so wealthy, and have basically wiped out the advertising opportunities of other media platforms, including most recently the Washington Post. We've seen mental health concerns about these platforms. And I have to say, this is very much overstated. The best scholarship on the connections between social media and mental health show that there is zero measurable effect. What we do find is those who are most already susceptible to dangerous mental health conditions are more likely to turn to social media. So there is a correlation between those who are suffering the most and excessive use of social media. That does not mean that excessive use of social media causes mental health maladies. In fact, just the opposite, just the opposite. That is what the scholarship really says, but we have seen officials around the world flip that and assume that excessive use of social media actually causes mental health maladies, and there is no evidence for that claim. I know this is a really unpopular and weird thing for me to say as one who's a major critic of these companies, but this is what the science says, and I have to stick with the experts, who are real experts. There are other people who are purported experts who are actually just pundits, who work for business schools and claim they understand the methodology of these studies, who are going around writing best-selling books and testifying before legislatures around the world and making a lot of money doing so, but it's largely a fraudulent claim. We do have some very interesting phenomena when it comes to finding like-minded people and being able to leverage that toward action in the world. We've seen that both in terms of legitimate political action, right? Lowering the search costs for finding like-minded people is a really good way to increase political engagement. Even, mainstream, reasonable, expected, positive political engagement by people of a variety of political positions, right? That's a healthy thing for society, along with seeing all of the potentially destructive stuff. Now, shifts in cultural values, I don't think we have a real sense of how things are shifting and what that really means. It also, I have to say, means different things in different parts of the world. But the economic influence is fascinating too. I mentioned earlier the concentration of advertising revenue in these two companies, Alphabet/Google, Meta/Facebook. The fact that these companies have attracted the bulk of global advertising money has meant that that money has been sucked away from newspapers, magazines, radio, television, et cetera, completely altering the formulas for how those industries have to try to make money, and for a variety of reasons, including changing what flies in social media, exposing the vulnerabilities of serious news gathering and reporting, making serious news gathering and reporting too expensive for most companies. We don't have an answer to this. This is one of the big challenges to democracy around the world. How can democracies thrive without serious professional journalism that is sustainable, that has social trust built into it, that has visible practices that ensure good faith reporting, editing, and delivery of news? How can citizens know what's going on if there are no local papers, and if the national papers they rely on run less and less news and do less and less reporting about the world? We're not really sure what to do about that. We have not come up with a replacement. Lots of smart people have been banging their heads for 30 years trying to figure that one out, and nobody has. And as I said yesterday, we saw the Washington Post, one of our great institutions of journalism, lay off half of its staff, close all of its foreign bureaus. There were reporters suffering in the winter of Ukraine who got emails saying they had been laid off. Right? That's the state we're in. How in the world are we going to run a democracy without reporters like that doing work like that? We've also seen this heavy reliance on hoovering up user data and being able to understand us intimately. This practice of constant, deep surveillance, the profiling of every one of us, so that they know or can guess with reasonable confidence our gender, our age, our wealth, our political opinions, our religion, our fandom. They don't have to know explicitly, even though we often just offer that up. They can mathematically predict that if you are like this other person they know this thing about, chances are you share that thing. You both like driving Fords. You both like wearing Nikes. You both vote Republican, right? It's not hard to make those connections statistically. They don't have to be perfect, but they're pretty good at it. And that changes tremendous number of practices and concentrates wealth and power in those companies that have the best, freshest, and most usable data about all of us. And that is our biggest concern. So I've already talked about one of the deleterious effects of social media on democracy, which is about our attention and the fact that there's no space for deliberation. That's one wing of it. That's like the demand side problem. The supply side problem is that the economy of social media has yielded concentrations of power. There are a handful of companies run by a handful of extremely wealthy men who have outsized political influence as well as social and intellectual influence over our daily lives. Everything they say gets quoted. Everything they do in their companies gets reacted to. Decisions they make affect the price of things in the market. Decisions they make affect the value of our retirement funds and our college funds. Decisions they make influence who gets to lead our governments. They have exorbitant political power around the world, not just in the United States. This is a deep concern for the future of democracy. We have allowed these companies to assert themselves and inject themselves in our lives, but also into our politics. in other words, into our systems of power. And it is a small club of like-minded men with similar opinions about the world, and some of those opinions are actually quite alarming. Many of them, like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, do not like democracy at all. Many of them are overt white supremacists and eugenicists, and I'm not exaggerating. I'm not exaggerating. And when people like that have inordinate political power, even when they fail at executing their plans on the world, they cause trouble for a lot of us, maybe for most of us. This is my biggest concern right now. And the concern is global. As I said, it's not just about the United States. The small group of men with inordinate power, they have influence in Moscow. They have influence in Brussels. They have tremendous influence in London right now. They influence Canada. They influence Australia. They influence Brazil and South Africa. And occasionally, a government will try to stand up to them. And if you saw on Inauguration Day a year ago, all of these 5 extremely wealthy, powerful men attend the inauguration of a person they had opposed for president just a few years before, it was quickly visible and understandable that they were doing so because they needed the power of the United States to stand up to Brazil. Brazil was about to, and in fact still is executing, strict regulations on these companies and their practices. The European Union is executing modest limitations on the practices of these companies. And so these leaders decided to support President Trump in an effort to get the power of the United States to head off these regulatory efforts in the European Union and Brazil. They've been successful in getting the Trump administration to adopt these policies. In fact, the vice president, who is very close to Peter Thiel, the aforementioned eugenicist, anti-feminist, anti-democracy activist, who's one of the richest people in the world, and he has been going to Europe and basically threatening Europe with higher tariffs if they don't roll back on some of these tech regulations, many of which are just basic common sense regulations that would allow for citizens of Europe to control their own data, for instance. But that's a big threat to Facebook, Google, Microsoft, et cetera. So what's happening now and next? I said that these systems of artificial intelligence have been built into these platforms for more than a decade in a variety of ways, starting with language translation, but ultimately they're being built into these systems in lots of other ways. And you may have noticed now, if you, for the last, let's say 18 months, if you've done a Google search, you're not actually doing a Google search in a classic way. Google presents a large language model distillation of what its huge collection of expression tells us about your question or prompt, right? So it's basically offering you the Google version of everything right away, so you don't have to go down and click on the original sources or anybody else's voice. This is a further concentration of attention and a further concentration of power through this alteration of what the Google search process looks like. You've also noticed probably as you use Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp that they're encouraging you to interact with the chatbots built into these systems. And that's just at the front end, the visible stuff. There's all sorts of back-end artificial intelligence being built into these systems as well. Now, artificial intelligence in its variety of forms is a perfect distillation of certain values. Number one being efficiency, right? And number two being convenience. Those are pretty close values. Now, they're important values, but they're not the only values. Unfortunately, the more that we shift our activities to systems and machines that are guided by these technologies, the more we are doubling down on efficiency and convenience at the expense of other important things. Now, one of my mentors, Neil Postman, used to ask, of any new technology, we should ask a couple of fundamental questions. Number one, what problem is it trying to solve? What problem does it purport to solve? And number two, what new problems does it cause? And number three, what technology does it displace? And number four, what activity does it amplify or extend, right? But let's get to the first one when it comes to artificial intelligence. What problem is it trying to solve? When you interact with artificial intelligence, and I know you do it with large language models, with chatbots, but you also do it every time you get get a price quote from an insurance company. You also do it every time you shop for an airline ticket. You also do it every time you shop on Amazon, because all of those prices are your prices, but not somebody else's prices. They're using artificial intelligence to predict what you might pay and coming up with the highest number that these systems predict you might pay, right? And that's especially true in the insurance world, which is highly embedded with artificial intelligence right now. Again, all opaque. We don't know how these systems actually work. We don't know how discriminatory these systems are. We don't know what the principles are, what the weights of the algorithms are. It's all proprietary. And that's not even getting close to how the large language models are affecting learning and thinking and writing and reading and all those other things we care about. So, I consider this a long-term threat to a fulfilling life. I consider this a long-term threat because it displaces other important values. And when I ask myself that question, what does artificial intelligence purport to solve? The only problem I see across the board is it solves the problem of people. People are messy, unpredictable, expensive. They require food and rest and medicine and all sorts of other expensive things. And I don't see an example of artificial intelligence solving a problem that is not about the very presence of human beings. Now, that's actually an exaggeration. There are some applications of artificial intelligence that are not based on the principles of artificial intelligence that we're usually talking about, right? And that involves, for instance, medical diagnoses. There are ways in which medical diagnoses systems, which are actually built on a completely different form of artificial intelligence, I don't want to get too nerdy on you, have great value and do solve problems that are invisible to the human eye. But those have yet to be actually proven and perfected either, but they offer great hope. But otherwise, people are the problem they're trying to solve. Well, I'm a person, and I like people, so I see that as a problem. And I think if we think of artificial intelligence in those terms, then we have a chance to ask harder questions and to push back and ask about the next wave of technology that we might not want to adopt into our lives with such speed and recklessness as we did the last suite of technologies. Because just now, we're trying to make sense of and come to terms with what social media did with us. Not to us, but with us. And I don't want to wait another decade or two before we have to look back and say, oh my gosh, how did we get here? Why did we let artificial intelligence change everything we do and desiccate our social, intellectual, and spiritual lives? And that's my biggest fear. Thank you for sticking with me through this rather depressing talk. Be happy to talk more.
So we have just a few minutes for questions. I thought we had a microphone, but I'm not seeing it, so you may have to speak loudly.
I'll repeat the question for the audience at home. Anybody have questions for me? Or you want to argue with me? That's cool too. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just pick up on the last. Thanks, by the way. That was very interesting. Lots to think about. So you know, despite all the depressing information you just fed us and the seemingly overwhelming hordes of social media to destroy our lives and democracy, you left us with this idea that AI can be resisted. But I'm wondering, are you thinking of this
Sure. So for people at home, the question is, what are the tools and methods of resistance to the increasing embedding of AI systems in our lives, right? Everything from insurance companies to Google searches to our cars, right? And other people's cars and Waymo and all of that, right? We're seeing it everywhere. Our refrigerators will soon be smart, if that actually means anything, which means we'll probably be dumber, right? Okay, the modes of resistance, I'm at the point where I see all hands have to be involved, right? We have to, first of all, cut through the hype, reject both utopian and dystopian visions of what might be coming. And by that I mean, a lot of the discussion about social media has been very distracting. It's either been about how it's going to liberate us to all be poets and dancers and play the harp, because all of a sudden we won't have to do any of this drudgery because machines will do it all for us, right? We've heard this for 100 years. It's been a lie for 100 years. Don't fall for that lie. But we also hear the dystopian that the machines will all band together and take over and kill us all, like the Matrix scenario or any other science fiction story. And the very people who have promoted artificial intelligence, including Elon Musk, have been going around the world saying this is our threat. The threat is extermination if we reach what's called artificial general intelligence, these machines that can then do whatever we do as humans, which nobody really defines very well. That is a complete lie as well. There is nothing about that scenario that is realistic. It is a completely evidence-free claim, but it's meant to get us worried about the science fiction disaster, and thus ignore the fact that today artificial intelligence is being used for instance, predictive policing in cities like Los Angeles and in Houston, right? The deployment of police forces in different parts of the city at different times of the day, week, and year is often guided by opaque proprietary systems that are sold to police departments, and they're told that, hey, we are going to predict where crime might happen based on all the data we've collected, and we're going to make sure you send your officers in proper concentrations at the proper time. Everything will be more efficient. You won't have officers patrolling streets where there's no crime. You'll have them all where there is crime. Well, guess what? They're using historical data. And guess what? The historical data comes from police departments that have historically over-policed certain communities and historically under-policed other communities. So of course, if you're using any historical data like arrest records or even conviction records, you're just replicating the sins of the past. In fact, you might be doubling down on them. That's what's happening in LA, that's what's happening in Houston, that's what's happening in other big cities that are relying increasingly on artificial intelligence to drive predictive policing choices and not relying on human judgment, because humans actually argue about those sorts of things. Like, hey, maybe you shouldn't be concentrating forces over here because there's stuff going on over here in a community, you just assume nothing's going on, right? That's a big problem. Predictive systems are being used for sentencing in states like Wisconsin, where predictions of recidivism rates for those who are convicted are being guided. Judges are being instructed to use these predictive, again, totally proprietary. We can't understand what's in them, how they're weighted. We know they rely on historical data. Well, of course, people from certain zip codes are going to be statistically more likely to commit further crimes, and they are going to get longer sentences. And guess what? That replicates the sins of the past against those very communities that have suffered the most by having families ripped apart by over sentencing and over policing, right? So we're seeing more and more of that, not less and less of that. We're seeing these systems built into missile guidance systems that are being used today in Ukraine, that were used until recently in Gaza, with terrible effects on civilians, because they don't actually work. Or maybe they do, but nobody's allowed to actually study whether they work. So human beings are less involved in deciding what gets blown up. Machines are more involved. The problem they're solving is human beings making decisions, second guessing, raising questions, right? That's a danger. These are all real world applications of artificial intelligence affecting people's lives today, but we are being asked not to pay attention to those, not to pay attention to the facial recognition technology that ICE is using around the country right now that often misidentifies people, which is one of the reasons why people who, not that anybody should be swept up by these guys, but a lot of people are very obviously not supposed to be the targets of ICE and yet are being swept up because of misrecognition, right? But we're not allowed to know how these systems were developed. We're not allowed to know if they were tested adequately. We're not allowed to know what goes into them because they're all proprietary, held by very strong contracts. And they're all supposed to be systems that learn from their mistakes, but we don't even know if that's happening. So all of this is actually happening right now. And we are being asked not to pay attention to that because we're supposed to be asking ourselves, is our job going to exist in 20 years? Not a bad question to ask. But what about if our neighbor's arrested tomorrow? That's actually a much more important question to ask, right? So that's part of the problem. So actually, I think, yeah, getting past the dystopian and utopian arguments about artificial intelligence is crucial. Making sure that people understand that these systems are affecting the price of insurance, the price of groceries, and the stability of their communities, right? They're increasingly affecting how teachers are paid and assessed. They're increasingly affecting what we're expecting of students in school. Like, everybody is being affected by this stuff, and yet it's all very invisible. Yes, hi. Oh, that's a great question. I wish I knew. All I know is it's more every day, right? And AI generated can mean different things, right? Because people can have fun with it, right? You can have image generation and video generation that is like clearly labeled and fun. I have a photo of me hugging a tiger. I love that one. It's like so obviously goofy. But I have one of me surfing. I don't surf. Would be a terrible surfer, but so a lot of it's just for fun, and that's okay. So it's hard to say like how much of it's meant to fool people, but we do know that that there are malevolent forces around the world that are creating distracting content and destructive content. The biggest problem, so the question is not so much about amount, but kind. So for instance, the image generator attached to X, the former Twitter, is able to create deep fake, sexually explicit images of anybody, and is. So there are lots of people who are finding really disturbing images of something close to themselves, generated and distributed by this platform. It's terrible. Like, there's no redeeming value in this, and it is hurting people. But because it's only hurting women, the people who run the company, X, are unconcerned because they're unconcerned about the safety of women and the well-being of women. In fact, hostile to it. And I'm not exaggerating that, right? And so that is a serious problem that is being unaddressed in most of the world. It is about to be addressed in France. France is on the verge of banning X/Twitter from use in France. And that is likely to happen in the next few weeks because they're violating French law by allowing people's images to be manipulated in such a way. And what's going to happen is Elon Musk is going to get on the phone with his former friend, the President of the United States, or his still friend, the Vice President of the United States, and they're going to threaten France with all sorts of things, including further tariffs. And it's probably not going to work. I'm pretty sure that the French government is not going to back down on this one because the policy is so popular within France, and frankly popular across the world. Nobody really wants, well, very few people really want the ability to produce deep fake nudes of people, but that's happening because a small number of really destructive, disturbed men love it, and they have friends in very powerful places like Elon Musk. So that, I think, is the biggest problem right now. Yes?
I'm wondering what you think about, first off, thank you so much for being here. I don't know if this is working, but
That's right.
I'm sure you can hear me.
Yeah, I'll repeat it too.
So in the context of like classrooms and like a lot of times with like professors, you know, they expect students to like turn in things on time, and you know, there's always an emphasis on like, you know, being timely, not just in the classroom, but like in the workforce and just
Right.
so I feel like a lot of students like use AI because like a lot of like the gratification of like, oh, like the expectation of like I have to get an A to like move forward instead of actually learning something. And
Yeah.
so I'm wondering, like what you said about like AI is like trying to like fix people, and like, you know, take away the, you know, nuanced individuals that people are. Like, do you think that there needs to be a shift in how, like the world treats people and like are trying to learn
Yeah.
and like, you know, just live? Like, how do, I don't know, like, do we need to completely reframe like so many topics before we like start talking about how AI should be used?
Yeah, I love how you phrase that. I love how you frame that. Because you made it, you know, talking about, first of all, starting with the use of, so students using large language models to generate content. And look, we all know the motivation. The motivation is to get things done. The motivation is to be productive. The motivation is to get through and do something on time so you can move on to the next thing. So you can, you know, do well in this class, so you can move on to the next class, so you can get your degree, so you can go into the world and be productive again. And that's all lovely, except that that's only about productivity, right? So then and I loved how you did this, like you turned it to a value question. What else should we be valuing, and how might we de-emphasize productivity and re-emphasize engagement and deliberation? How can we create a reward system for deep deliberation that isn't just about, I need you to write 20 pages and turn it in by December 1st, right? Or I guess we're looking at, you know, April 29th this semester, right? Like, I say those words all the time. I need you to write 20 pages and get it to me by April 29th. Is that teaching? And the person who writes that and makes it by that deadline, is that learning? Maybe it's a necessary but insufficient condition for teaching and learning, but the real work, the real value is in what gets done and how it gets done, and the mistakes one makes along the way, or the swings and misses, or the questioning and arguing and feedback. So one of the things everybody who does my job, and there are a lot of us in this room, are struggling with, but sometimes succeeding with, is restructuring the learning process to be one of constant iterative conversation with people who are learning, right? And making learning collaborative, visible, incremental, trying to lower deadline stress and de-emphasize the productivity question and re-emphasize the engagement, learning, deliberation process. That's really hard to do at scale. You know, there was an article that ran in the Atlantic Monthly yesterday on their website, and it'll probably be in the magazine soon, by a fellow named Ian Bogost, who teaches at Washington University in St. Louis. And he's a really good friend of mine. He's like an expert on games. He's this really sophisticated thinker. And he went around to small liberal arts colleges like Amherst College and interviewed students and professors about how they are dealing with this moment, not only of the attacks on universities, attacks on curriculum, attacks on freedom of thought and freedom of speech at universities, but also the presence of these technologies that are all geared to satisfy our hunger for productivity. And he found that at those places, they haven't had to change much because they've never been about productivity. They've always been about creating communities of deliberation. And that's largely because most of these institutions are originally emerged from churches. And they in many ways carried on the practices of churches, right? But also they've never been of the scale that they had big labs and 300 student chemistry lectures. But here at the University of Houston, at the University of Texas where I went, at the University of Buffalo where my father taught, there's no other choice but the 300-person chemistry lecture. Like, we need to handle that demand at scale with the labor force we have. What else are we going to do? Hire 50 more chemistry professors to teach it all in a seminar form? Wow, I wish. That would be a much better world if we could, but it's not going to happen, right? And chemistry might not be the ideal place for that, even though poetry is the ideal place for that, right? So, but we do have to think deeply about how every one of us, no matter what we teach, no matter how big the class is, are focusing on dialing down the stress, dialing down the emphasis on completion and deadlines and accumulation of credits, and dialing up the question of exploration, forgiving error, working with difficulties, not against difficulties, not punishing difficulties. That's going to take so much more work. Basically, all of our jobs are getting so much harder. But if we crack this, our jobs might actually become more satisfying in the long run. Anyway, I hope so.
All right, I'm afraid we're out of time for this evening. Might be around for 5 or 6
Yeah,
minutes.
it's just, I need to finish my water, so if you want to come up and chat. Right.
But thank you for coming, and let's once again thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, we've had 20 years of consistent results of 0, 0, 0, 0 effect. I mean, after a while, you just have to say,
Well, but the way I would look at that is there are very few studies that are actually like wearing a football and say this is a scientific study. It's all
no, they are actually scientific studies. Yes, hundreds, I promise you. I can pull up the bibliography.
so you know what?
Yeah, sure. Let me give you my card. Yeah. I can point you to the 5 most influential researchers in the field, none of whom respect John Haidt. They know he's basically.
I know the controversies. I do.
I mean,
I'm very familiar.
It's just like the people who do the work are so apoplectic about the situation right now.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I would just like to take a look at that too, and yeah. But the other thing that I want to say is that, as my pushback, is like a lot of things, it supplants the very activities that grow us as humans.
Absolutely.
And that can be a knockoff. You know what I'm saying? So
Right,
when,
right.
if you're saying, yeah, social media doesn't cause it, but social media causes